The number five most commonly, other than satisfied control, not an auditing and logging requirement here. 3.11.2 vulnerability scan, which says scan for vulnerabilities in organizational systems and applications periodically, and when new vulnerabilities affecting those systems and applications are identified.
All right.
How hard could it be, Amira? How hard could it be?
What a sigh.
This is one of the harder technical ones, but it is also misunderstood. So we've taken that nice sentence that Jacob just read off, and we've split it out 5 different ways. Mm-hmm. So first off, you need to define how often you're going to scan for vulnerabilities. Let's see. And then you actually need to show that you do the vulnerability scans at that frequency. Now, they split it out by organizational systems, which I assume means, say, Windows Server, firewalls, desktops, Linux servers. And then they split it out by applications. Now, applications can mean different things depending on the assessor. When I think applications, I'm thinking of fairly complex server apps that you install, like database systems, ERP systems, websites.
ERP is the first thing that comes to mind when I think of a major sort of business application that would be called out here.
Right.
At least that would commonly show up for defense contractors.
But what about cloud apps?
What was that?
What about cloud apps?
Oh boy.
That's an inheritance thing.
Okay. Let's everybody tighten down the strap on your boonie hats here. We'll save the cloud apps conversation for a little later.
Yeah.
That's a totally different topic, which we do need to talk about at some point.
But that's where the misconception comes in, is that people think, oh, yeah, my cloud apps are scanned because I inherit everything. And then they ignore the things like the ERP system and other things that are in scope. So that is one of the reasons why this is commonly missed, because it is a very complex requirement.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So somebody needs to scan those cloud apps. Hopefully you're making sure that your cloud vendor is scanning their cloud apps. That's the very short version of the story.
Yeah.
So the reason why applications are called out separately is because quite often in those complex programs, there's vulnerabilities inside the program that you cannot realize. You cannot see them from outside. You have to actually log into the program and run through it to find the vulnerabilities on the inside. Mm-hmm. So if you simply scan the outlying Linux server, for example, it might not realize that you have a vulnerability inside your WordPress website or inside your database.
Gotcha.
Next, let's see. So the next way that people misunderstand this is it requires you to do the scans both on a certain frequency as well as when new vulnerabilities are identified.
Right.
And that's real tricky. So does anybody remember the Log4Shell vulnerability? It was like 2 years ago, right? And like all the companies had vulnerable systems. Mm-hmm. That's an example of doing a vulnerability scan when new vulnerabilities are identified. So when you start getting the CISA alerts and the LinkedIn conversation going, oh my goodness, this is big.
Yeah.
You want to be able to show the assessors that you ran a ad hoc manual vuln scan based on that information.
Which should be a relatively easy way to kind of, start getting, reassuring your assessor that things are going well, because for people that are paying attention, when they walk in the door, they could say, hey, when Heartbleed came out, when Log4Shell came out, when Hafnium happened, and everyone on the planet who was tuned in at all knew that there was a thing to look for in these indicators, what did you do? And the answer should be, we did what everybody else did. We scanned for this thing in accordance with the guidance from CISA or wherever we get it from. And, we move on with our lives. But if you didn't do that, that's a pretty easy one to miss. There is no sort of halfway on that one, right? Like it's, you're either you either have your ear to the ground and doing what the guidance says, or you're just going to miss this control. So
another thing that could get people with CMMC, and this one is up for some debate, so I'm not going to say that I know for sure what the right answer is, but to me, this reads as an enterprise type of requirement, meaning that you don't just scan the systems that have CUI on them.
Right.
You scan the other stuff in your network too.
You would hope so. I mean, and this is like, stepping back from like the CMMC or CUI enclave, like all of your internal, external system boundaries, like vulnerability management is some blocking and tackling basic security stuff, right? I mean, when you talk about scoping, which I know, Amira, you've got some content that recently came out that goes into scoping, you can get really in the weeds about like where the controls apply. But when we're talking like logging, vulnerability management, I mean, these are pretty basic, like universal, will never not be top 5 recommendations from anyone on the planet ever kind of thing, right?
If you're not spreading it across the enterprise, you're just introducing a whole world of hurt that you don't want to talk about, right?
I mean, I guess you could say we only do vulnerability management within the CUI enclave because that's the only thing we have to do. But I mean, come on. Like this you're really playing with fire at that point, and that's not a smart thing to do.
Because lateral movement can still happen, and it'll be undetected lateral movement, and all you have is logical boundaries in place, and those logical boundaries can be poked and prodded at up until the point where stuff happens. So
and I would generally, as an assessor, I would only look at your enclave. If you say that that's where I have the CUI, I'm only going to look inside the boundaries of that enclave, but I want to see that you understand the vulnerabilities at play with your firewall, with your gateways, with your remote devices. Sure. Another way this can go wrong is you're not getting your remote users. Mm-hmm. So if you send people home with laptops, you should have a method to scan those laptops. And typically that means that you will install an agent on the laptops that can reach out, or they can phone home and get scanned.
Right.
If you don't have an agent like that, then it can be a little bit more difficult to get them. But you are expected to scan everything.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And just stylistically, before we head off of this control, this is one of the ways that NIST decides to design control language that I have an issue with, because this is really 2 controls that are compounded together. Right? They're the same idea, but scanning for vulnerabilities in organizational systems, scanning for vulnerabilities in applications, both on a periodic basis, are 2 different things. Separate from that, scanning for vulnerabilities that affect those systems or applications when new vulnerabilities are identified. And so when you look at the assessment objectives, we're really doing the same 3 things twice, right? We are defining a period, then we are doing the vulnerability scanning within that defined period for org systems and apps. In addition to that, we are saying when new stuff comes up, we are doing vulnerability scanning. And so, like you were saying, you really mask a lot of stuff under the hood with just these like very open-ended compound control statements that are listed in 171. If you do not look at 171A, you will 100% miss what that control is talking about. I don't personally agree with those design choices. I think that, there's a case to be made on NIST side that they're doing this to make it more open-ended and flexible, but it really just ends up being more confusing for everybody because they're 2 separate documents. So please, please, please look at the assessment objectives. That is really, after a while, and I think you've probably seen this, Amira, especially teaching so many courses, after a while, when you read the control statements, you can kind of tell what the assessment objectives are going to ask for because of some of the key words that show up. But it's really difficult to do it, especially for people that don't have a lot of experience with the way that NIST phrases things with these compound sentences and these like sort of hidden keywords in there.
It is so common that we other than satisfy companies because they forgot to define something.
Yep.
It's the silliest reason to fail one of these requirements. This vulnerability scan on a medium business, performing this might cost $10,000, $20,000 per year. Writing a sentence is like a $10 thing, and they could fail their assessment because they forgot to define something.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, the perspective that I always tell people to remember is that, you can make it obvious for you within your organization, but your assessor is coming in and they don't work at your organization. And so how would you show somebody, the real question with 171A is all the assessment objectives are ultimately rolling up to, how do you know that a control is implemented properly, configured correctly, operating the way you intended, and producing the desired outcomes? How would you know, right? The way you know is by answering all of the questions as assessment objectives. Same thing. Inherently that I got the right answer on this math problem. But if you don't show me the work on the math problem, man, I don't know how you got the answer. And so will I miss the points on this math problem on the test, even though I got the right answer? Yes, because I don't know how you got the answer. 171A is, how do you get the answer to the math question? No one ever likes showing their work in math class, but we all know why we end up having to do it, right? That's always the metaphor that I end up using. And this control, I think, is a good example of why it's so important.
You just triggered my trigonometry PTSD, dude.
Like, your trigonometry?
Yeah. Triggered my trigonometry, yeah.
It's a tongue twister.
Yeah.
Trigonometry twister.
Rapidly ascending up here the list, number 4 of most commonly other than satisfied requirements, 3.11.1 risk assessments, which says periodically, here's that word again, periodically assess risk to the organizational operations, including mission, functions, image or reputation, organizational assets, and individuals resulting from the operation of organizational systems and the associated processing, storage, or transmission of CUI. Thanks for nothing, NIST, because we had a 5-word sentence 3 controls ago, and now we've got this behemoth here. What are they talking about, Amira?
They basically want a document that writes down a list of your assets. And look at this. NIST has given us a list of things to consider as assets. Our mission, our functions, our reputation, our organizational assets, our individuals. Right?
Like,
these are all
risk assets, if you will, right? Risk assets, if you will.
Right. Things that could get attacked.
Sure.
That could be threatened. So identify the assets, which should include your CUI, and then identify what could attack them from a cyber adversary or cyber threat perspective. This could also include physical threats like tornadoes, hurricanes. Figure out how you are trying to reduce risk from those threats and actually lay out kind of a numerical score, right? So our risk from phishing is 50 out of 100. Our risk from somebody walking into our building and putting a bad thumb drive in is 5 out of 100, mm-hmm. right? Significant differences in risk. They could both be bad, but the odds that somebody's actually going to come to your computer and attack the computer as opposed to a prince in Nairobi
sending you an email,
right. A little bit different, right? One's much more likely than the other. Both might be equally bad.
Right.
And then you need to look at these resulting risk numbers and say, which ones can I accept? Which ones need to be lowered? Right. So we might have decided that phishing number being 50 out of 100 is way too high. We're going to get ransomware. It's going to be a disaster. We cannot allow it. So what do we need to do to reduce risk further? Well, Can we implement a spam filter? Can we set up a system where attachments to emails are detonated before they get delivered, right? Just to see if they're bad. Can we set up a DNS filter, right? All of these things you can add, and they reduce the risk. And then you can, again, calculate that score. And now maybe your phishing email score is a 10 out of 100. And you go, that's pretty good, right? Yeah. Anything more than this is going to start costing me way more than what I think would happen to my company over the next 5 years.
Right. Yeah. And the interesting thing about risk assessment is in the world of the much larger catalog of NIST controls in 853, from which 800-171 is directly derived, risk assessment is the ultimate precursor to all of the other controls, because whether or not you include those controls and to which degree you implement and configure and tighten down those controls are a function of your risk assessment, which in the context of how 853 was designed, these are a catalog of controls that are designed to be handed to federal agencies and organizations that have enterprise management, that have risk assessment, that have all of these issues. And so the 853 catalog never needed to explain how to do a risk assessment, what method to use, subjective, objective, your mathematical, whatever method you decide to use to assess your risk was a foregone conclusion. It was the idea that you were doing it, which is the entire reason why you were looking at the controls. So the idea that risk assessment is one of the most commonly other than satisfied controls conceptually means that your implementation and configuration of every other control in 800-171 is sort of disconnected from your concept of risk. One of the very, very common criticisms that we hear about 800-171 is it is not risk-based. And yet one of the most commonly missed other than satisfied requirements is risk assessment. So, we've got a little bit of a sort of disjointed conversation around the requirements here, I think.
This is one of my favorite requirements, if you can say any of them are a favorite. I think that this provides so much value to an organization, because anytime the DoD lets us use our brains to figure out better ways to protect our environments in an efficient manner, it's amazing. We need to take advantage of it.
Yeah. And I mean, really, this control statement is saying, hey, we're really just there to see what you're doing with your risk assessment when it is associated with the processing, storage, transmission of CUI. But that does not preclude you from using this as a very basic outline or framework for your risk assessment for your enterprise, for your whole organization. The DoD just wants their assurance that, hey, when you have our CUI in your environment, you're also extending all of that stuff over to these CUI assets as well, right? Yes. Okay, great. So if you haven't done your risk assessment in a formal way, this is a great way to start, if you will.
And this ties into the DFARS 252-204-7012 adequate security, where they say you shall do the 800-171 requirements and, adequate security. If you see that there is a major risk to your environment that's not covered by those 110 requirements, they still expect you to resolve the risk.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Phishing is a great example, right? There's no requirement to have spam filtering right now. There's no requirement to detonate attachments before you try and run them on workstations.
RIP Delta 20 from CMMC 1.0. Rest in peace, buddy.
Yep, I know. Those were great requirements.
Objectively good security requirements.
But they're no longer there. But if you do a risk assessment, pretty much any company today should be going, wow, I think I need those if I don't want to have downtime and rebuild all my computers due to ransomware.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's it's a great point. Alrighty. On to the top three now. Top three. So the third most commonly other than satisfied control, 3.14.1, flaw remediation. identify, report, and correct information and information system flaws in a timely manner. What?
I am just grateful that NIST didn't split information away from information system flaws.
Okay.
Because that would have resulted in 12 assessment objectives instead of 6 here.
Sure.
So
see,
this
they
is
were helping us. They were doing. See?
Yeah.
So yeah, what's everybody up in arms about?
This is basically just saying patch your systems. Patch your systems.
A flaw
right?
being exactly what it sounds like.
Yep. But the reason why, in my mind, this is probably misunderstood is because we have just a ton of documentation, and like it splits it out into things that top level statement doesn't really make evident. Yeah. So, for example, you need to specify how long you have to identify new system flaws. Mm-hmm. Great. 1 month, right? Whatever. Sounds 90 good. Days, 30 days,
they
15
don't specify
days,
the value in 853 parlance, which we anticipate that in the upcoming revision of 171, they will include the 853 way of describing this. This would be known as an organizationally defined value, right? How often you need to conduct your backups, how often you need to do whatever your defined parameter is defined by the organization, and organizationally defined value.
Right. Now, the next one, which very few people specify, is how long you have to report system flaws, right? And then it gets into how long you have to correct system flaws. Now, in a typical small, medium business, we just patch the systems, right? It's Patch Tuesday. We tell the systems to install, we reboot them, we go on. But according to these assessment objectives, no. We need to somehow document that we told somebody that there's system patches available. And then we have to identify that there's system patches available somehow in a recorded manner for evidence. Mm-hmm. Then we have to tell somebody, again, in a recorded manner for evidence, that the patches are available. And then we need to patch them. Mm-hmm. Most companies just skip to the end. They just patch.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And by breaking it into these multiple stages, they're assuming that you have like a dedicated vulnerability / vendor management team, right. And then you have a dedicated ticket team, maybe an engineering team to test.
Which sounds a lot like, the echoes of a larger federal organization for which 853 was designed. This was whittled down, and they said, well, if you're doing patch management and vulnerability management, how else would you possibly be doing it if you didn't have a team of people working on it, right?
Right.
Which, this is, and to be fair, this is less of a CMMC problem than it is with the underlying requirements and their assumptions problem that CMMC has exposed to the world, if you will.
They are assuming that these small companies have a unlimited government budget for IT.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit problematic. But good news for this one, just make sure you specify it, include some process to note when you identify system flaws, and then some process to report, aka put in a ticket.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's maybe mimicking that this control, maybe mimicking your vulnerability management control, and sort of doing the same types of things you do for, hey, we found out about this. This is the fix. This is what we're going to do. Like you said, conceptually, people don't really think about that in terms of their patching, but maybe if you follow along with the one that we talked about previously with vuln management, you're probably getting closer to what this control is looking for.
Yeah, there's some that you could wait for Patch Tuesday, and then there's some like 0-day stuff or 0-day associated stuff that you're going to want to act on as soon as possible. So
sure. All righty, Amira, the number two here. Number two, if you're not first, you're last, but this is a big one. 3.5.3, multi-factor authentication. Use multi-factor authentication for local and network access to privileged accounts and for network access to non-privileged accounts. Every time there's an and in one of these control statements, I get very annoyed. But ultimately, we're talking MFA here. This is the second most common, other than satisfied control. It's probably the most common recommendation that you hear from everyone. So what the heck is going on?
This is a combination of misunderstandings as well as technical issues.
Okay.
So most companies have a fairly easy approach to set up multi-factor authentication for network access, meaning their core directory can prompt for multi-factor when you are signing into Active Directory or Okta or whatever you have, right, with your main accounts. Though I will say some companies, they have systems that are not terribly standard. But okay, so fun information. Basically, all of the core requirements that we see in 853, they assume that you can perform them because Windows can do it.
Ah, okay.
Right? The government's been using Windows for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
They don't write requirements that Windows cannot do.
It's a very good point.
Just a fun fact. So sometimes you've got systems that are not Windows based and you can't do MFA on them. Mm-hmm. And that might be a case where you have a technical issue, which could certainly knock lots of companies out. One of the strategies for that is putting into place a multi-factor prompt before you reach that system. Gotcha. So if you've got a weird system that is not able to do MFA, you can put a jump box mm-hmm. or a virtual desktop or something in front of it, make people MFA to that, and then they can reach to that other system once they have multi-factor.
Which as far as a deployment perspective is not incredibly complicated compared to a standard deployment on everything. I mean, it is an extra step, but it's not really crazy as far as technical impact. Although if you're getting by on a shoestring and trying to figure this out on your own, it might be a pretty big step. But it is a good recommendation, though.
Mm-hmm. It is definitely a process of designing your architecture so that people can't circumvent that protected method.
Now, here's a live one for you. Now, would that sort of placing that MFA prompt in front of the system that itself cannot have MFA on it be what you would consider in NIST's language to be one of these alternatives or compensating controls or implementations?
In this case, I would not. I would actually just consider it a plain implementation of this practice.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Alternative implementations are
something literally an alternative, right?
Yeah, they're tricky and dangerous. Yes.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting topic for sure. But MFA. So, and this is bigger picture. We've talked about this on the show before. When Nick Del Rosso got up at CS2 Huntsville and said the top 10 other than satisfied controls have not changed since the last time I got up on stage at CS2 6 months ago. And the number 2 most common other than satisfied control is MFA. And long before Nick Del Rosso and DIBCAC started compiling their data, we saw that MFA was just not being implemented. That does not build a case for the DoD to decide to do something other than come and assess you, right? The fact that MFA is so important, universally recommended. Jen Easterly talks about MFA as the director of CISA literally every time she posts something, speaks into a microphone. It is MFA is the first thing that she talks about. And so if MFA is not being implemented broadly, and it is a finding by DoD's own assessors, then you can guarantee it will be a point of emphasis. It's not something that's going to go away. So the higher
so even
up
Nick has said,
right? Yeah.
Yeah, Nick has said multiple times that this is not necessarily a people who are completely overlooking and ignoring this. This is one of those smack on the forehead moments where they're like, "Oh, I didn't even realize that I needed to have MFA on that particular server,"
Yeah,
or "Oh, yeah, you know what I mean." So it's like incomplete implementations where they tried, they gave it the all valiant effort, and then, oh, wait, you mean I got to put it on there too and on there too?
yeah.
So I mean, that is one thing that has to be thrown out there when we talk about this. Like,
For sure.
it's been in CISA alerts for 10 years. For
Yeah.
10 years, one of the most recommended things on any CISA alert has been MFA. Like you said, Jen Easterly is always about MFA, MFA, MFA. Everybody, MFA, MFA, MFA. But they're doing it. They just don't know how to do it. And Amira touches on that in a lot of the stuff. It's like, is it adequate? Is it sufficient?
Yeah. I have heard horror stories of people failing this requirement because their firewall does not force them to do MFA, which is horrifying to me because there's not a whole lot of firewalls that support MFA.
Yeah.
But again,
it's pretty wild to think about, on its own, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But you can, again, architecture, right? So don't allow connections to your firewall from outside that can log into the firewall. Like, make sure that login comes from the inside, and then make sure people go through an MFA process before they reach it, at the very least. Now, there's a couple other ways that you can mess this one up. First off, out of the blue, we have an assessment objective that says privileged accounts are identified. Where did that come from? Right. But you just need to be able to identify, here's my list of privileged accounts, as part of the assessment for this requirement. And then the next thing that people often miss, in fact, I missed it for about 6 months when I was starting to do CMMC, and I had a heart attack in 2021, is you need to have multi-factor for local access to privileged accounts. What that means is if you log into a server locally, keyboard and mouse, you need to have a multi-factor prompt. If you log into a computer locally using a privileged account, you need to have a multi-factor prompt. And that is not standard.
Right.
Most of our clouds, when we log into them, most of our directories can do multi-factor. This is separate from that.
Yep. Yeah, local admin, right?
Yep. So if you have the ability to log into these devices with a privileged account locally, which basically everyone does, you need to have some sort of a multi-factor authentication. Now, one exception, and not directly to this topic, but just in terms of multi-factor, people really struggle with service accounts, right? I want to set up an account to run my backup every night. I want to do an account to connect these two systems together. And if you turn multi-factor on, it will break. That's understood by assessors. We do understand how computers work, at least most of us do. So if you say, look, there's a reason why this account, which is not used by users, and we've got the password extremely long and is kept in a safe, there's a reason why this does not have MFA turned on. In general, we're going to go with you as long as it's reasonable.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, definitely. Those are great tips. All righty, Amira. It's upon us. Everyone's favorite requirement, everyone's favorite control, the number one pick in the CMMC draft here, 3.13.11, CUI encryption, which says employ FIPS validated cryptography when used to protect the confidentiality of CUI. Only one sentence, no ands, only one assessment objective, number one most commonly other than satisfied requirement. What is going on?
This is a combination of technical as well as misunderstanding.
I think also the universe often conspiring against people who would otherwise try to do the right thing. I mean, the FIPS validated crypto thing it has to be the number one hot button issue inside the requirements of 800.171 in general outside of CMMC itself. But I'm interested in your perspectives too.
I am pretty sure there are people screaming at their screens right now.
Yeah, if you're listening to this while you're driving, please pull over and get out of your car, do some push-ups, right? We got to wait for revision 3 to come out. But yes, we know, everyone knows no one likes this requirement.
Yep. So I'm almost afraid to talk to this because I know there's people screaming. But so there's a couple aspects to this. I'm actually going to talk about how to make this work for you.
Okay, great.
Okay. So FIPS validated cryptography, what that's talking about is you are using a application or a hardware device which has gone through the cryptographic module validation program by NIST, and that you actually can find a certificate from NIST saying this thing is good. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, that's the part where people misunderstand this requirement. So they might actually be doing FIPS validated cryptography, or they might have equipment that can do it, but they're not doing that research project to go find the certificate number or download the certificate so that they can show their assessors. Yeah. A lot of the most common equipment that we use in enterprises, Windows computers, MacBooks, most of our firewalls, a lot of that enterprise class stuff can do the FIPS validated cryptography. Yeah. It is FIPS validated.
It's a mode in Windows. It's a radio button that you select.
It's available, but people aren't doing the steps to turn it on, or they're just simply not doing the research to say, okay, here's my data flow. I use this exact application for CUI, and here's how we have FIPS enabled for that application to protect the confidentiality of it. Now, regarding when used to protect the confidentiality of CUI, such an important statement, okay? Protecting the confidentiality of CUI. Mm-hmm. CUI is not passwords.
Whoa! We just talked with Ryan Bonner last episode about this at length. I wholeheartedly agree with you.
Oh, good. Okay. CUI is not keyboards.
I feel like that's an example. I feel like that's an example that you have rooted in real world experience.
There are people that think that you need to have a FIPS validated keyboard.
I mean, the letters. To be fair, the letters CUNI are right here on my keyboard.
And it's wireless, and if I type things that may be CUI, it's transmitted.
And
I don't know.
All kidding aside, right? This is what happens when you pursue flexibility and open-endedness in requirements statements. Is it opens the doors for people who are wanting to do the right thing to over-interpret what's going on. There's nothing there to stop them because you took all those details out of the statement. So all joking aside, it is completely understandable that happens.
Yes, but I'm trying to spread the word that you don't need to stress yourself out about those things. It really is about CUI, and CUI is like diagrams. It's text. Mm-hmm. It's information. It's not other things.
Right.
And then when we get into this word confidentiality, so if you are using cryptography to protect the confidentiality of CUI, it needs to be FIPS validated. Right. If you are doing other things to protect the confidentiality of CUI, does not apply this. Okay, so if you have a locked room with an armed guard in front of it, which neither one is cryptography, you don't need FIPS validated.
Right.
Okay. So there's different ways to protect the confidentiality of CUI, namely physically.
Yeah.
And this one doesn't even apply in that case.
Yep. But
and that goes to a lot of the
when you're using
requirements.
crypto to do it, that crypto has to be FIPS validated. That's
Yes.
the catch. Yep.
So I do have a kind of like a pile-on question to this, Amira. You said that I need a CMVP cert, a cryptographic module validation program cert for my FIPS validated encryption. But when I look at the CMVP, the marketplace, right, the website that they have that demonstrates all these validation certificates, I see some that are listed under technologies and then some that are specific modules. So how do I know which one of these is applicable to my environment?
Well, that's where you sign into the Kieri Center of Excellence.
Oh, plug, ding, 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 ding.
So if anybody is wondering what that is, reach out to probably any of us, and we can send you an invite. It's a
We'll
form.
put a link in the show notes too, as well, to the highly regarded Kieri Center of Excellence.
But that's a great place because everybody's already researched most of the enterprise software and apps out there, and we've already talked about it. So there's a great amount of knowledge there. When I go to the CMVP, I typically search by vendor, and that's how I find most of the certificates. So Microsoft, Apple, Cisco. For the folks that have already purchased firewalls that are not in that list, and you need to use those firewalls, their VPN, to protect the confidentiality of CUI, I am sorry, life sucks for you. This is where it gets bad, right?
Yeah.
But you do not need to double encrypt your CUI. So if you have your CUI encrypted in transit using a different method, for example, your web browser has established a secure session to a cloud, you don't need to double encrypt it with the VPN.
Right.
You just need to use FIPS validated encryption once.
Yep.
So there are ways, in many cases, to again architect your environment,
right,
so that it's good.
And I'm getting back to the idea of risk assessment as a fundamental precursor. The idea that you have thought through this architecture and how your data flows throughout it is a big presupposition before you ever get to this requirement. So that's why it feels like you're constantly uncovering and pulling the onion back and back and back. If you didn't think about your architecture and how all of that's working beforehand, then you sort of get the bad news whenever you come across this requirement, and you have to reverse engineer your architecture to figure out what's going on.
The last thing I want to point out about this, temporary deficiency.
That's what I was about to ask.
Yep. I think we are all waiting to ask you the $1 million question here, Amira.
I was like, when can I cut in so can I ask this question?
So bear with me. I actually bring up, actual vendor names, real software. I used to be a Windows admin for 20 years, so I know Windows. One of the things that I struggled with was Windows 10, as an example, super popular, lots of people using it, was the last version that was FIPS validated was from like 2018. And that is now out of support.
Yeah.
Like you can't get patches for it anymore, which means that you'd be failing other things.
We just talked about flaw remediation.
Yep. So people are like, what do I do? Do I not patch? Do I patch? If I patch, it's no longer FIPS validated. This is impossible. So the DoD has actually, on this topic, they have released guidance as part of the DFARS Cyber FAQ, which hopefully Jacob will put a link.
Yep, we'll definitely do that.
But they say, hey, if it's a choice between FIPS and patching, do a risk assessment, pick which one is the best option, and go for it.
Yeah, the answer is patch. It's always patch.
The answer is patch,
It's patch.
In general.
Yeah.
The next thing is they talk about temporary deficiencies, and this is fun. Remember how I mentioned that the government uses Windows, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have this problem too, just like us. And not only are they...
Are we so different?
not only are they 5 years past their validated version, but they would like to use Windows 11, which is super duper not FIPS validated. Right? So I actually talked to DoD CIO about this, and I said, I'd like to use Windows 11. Like, what do I do? And they said, well, that is a prime use of a plan of action. And as long as you have a plan to get it FIPS validated with a date, that's considered a temporary exception.
That seems like a very reasonable answer. That seems like something that we can all agree on. FIPS validation is great when it's available, and it's consistently not available. So we shouldn't hold up other good security as a result, right? That seems like a very reasonable interpretation.
Now, what I would not recommend trying is taking something that has never been FIPS validated and saying, I'm going to use that in the hope that it will become FIPS validated.
And that's exactly, we posted a clip from Nick Del Rosa's CS2 talk on the YouTube channel a couple weeks ago, which we can add the link to, where he basically said the exact same thing, where if it's obvious that, you're planning on doing it as soon as it's available, or it once was FIPS and then the module's not out yet, that's not your fault. They're not going to ding you for that. But if you are just like, oh, it'll be FIPS validated one day, that's a different problem.